The story of Joseph is set during the second intermediate period of Egyptian history, when the Semitic Hyksos were ruling over Egypt. However, Joseph's story really begins in the land of Canaan when he's 17 years old, when his dad sends him to spy on his brothers and he brings back a bad report. Now Israel, aka Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his other kids, and he made a colorful coat for Joseph, and his brothers hated him for it. Later, Joseph told his brothers about a dream he had, which made them hate him even more. He dreamed that his brothers had 11 sheaves of grain that bowed down to his single sheaf. And later, Joseph dreamed that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down before him. His brothers didn't like this dream either. Joseph told his dad the dream, and he also didn't care for it. He was like, "What are you, crazy? You think your brothers and your mother and I will bow to you?" Which begs the question, what was the meaning of the dreams? Well, the 11 sheaves represent the 11 brothers. The one sheaf is Joseph. The 11 sheaves bowing to the one sheaf represents the 11 brothers bowing to Joseph. Also, the sun bowing to Joseph represents the father bowing to Joseph, the moon bowing to Joseph represents the mother bowing to Joseph, and the 11 stars bowing to Joseph represent the 11 brothers bowing to Joseph. Sometime later, Israel once again sent Joseph out to spy on his brothers, but his brothers saw him coming in the distance and they plotted to kill him. Reuben tried to protect Joseph and prevented the others from killing him. Instead, they took Joseph's coat and threw him in a cistern and then sat down and ate lunch. While Reuben was gone, the other brothers decided to sell Joseph as a slave to some Ishmaelite traders who were passing by, though the text also refers to these traders as Midianites. And Joseph's brothers sold him for 20 pieces of silver. When Reuben came back and found out, he was angry, but the brothers convinced him to tell their father that a wild animal ate Joseph, and they put goat blood on Joseph's coat and gave it to their father. The traders took Joseph to Egypt and sold him as a slave to a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's guards. At this point, the Joseph story begins to follow the life of his older brother, Judah, and the text says that Judah leaves his brothers and goes off on his own. Judah married a Canaanite woman, and they had 3 sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah. The text says that Judah got a wife for his son Er named Tamar, but because Er was so wicked, God eventually got tired of him and killed him off. According to the custom of the day, Tamar was then given to Onan to be his wife. Onan wanted to dishonor his family, so whenever he would have sex with Tamar, he would refuse to go all the way. And God didn't like Onan very much either, so he killed him too. Judah was afraid to give Tamar to his last son, Shelah, so he dishonored her and told her that she would just have to go be a widow for a while, and he sent her back to her father. And the text says that a long time later, Judah's wife died. Sometime after that, Judah went up to shear his sheep, and when Tamar found out that Judah was in the area, she dressed up as a prostitute and waited for him to walk through town. Judah saw her but didn't recognize her, and they ended up having sex, and Judah promised to give her a goat as payment. But Tamar made him give her his staff and his seal as a pledge until he kept his word, and after Judah left, Tamar found out she was pregnant. Judah later sent his servant back to the town with the goat to pay the prostitute, but the prostitute was nowhere to be found, so they gave up out of fear of becoming a laughingstock, walking around town with a goat asking about a prostitute that apparently didn't exist. Later, Judah heard a rumor that his daughter-in-law Tamar was guilty of playing the whore and was now pregnant, so Judah had her brought out to be burned. Tamar then pulled out Judah's staff and seal and said, "The man who got me pregnant left these behind." Judah was embarrassed and confessed that she was more righteous than he was, and Tamar gave birth to twin boys. The first boy stuck his hand out, and the midwife put a red string on his wrist. But then he drew his hand back in, and his brother came out first. The twins were named Perez and Zerah. Perez means breaking out, and Zerah means bright red. Now, this story has a connection to King David and to Christ, and the fact that both individuals were directly descended from the result of this perverted relationship that Judah had with his daughter-in-law. This also shows that God can redeem all situations. God used this terrible story to give Israel David, their greatest king, as well as the Messiah for the whole world, Jesus. But let's go back to Joseph's story now. Joseph was working in the house of Potiphar, where God blessed everything he did. But Potiphar's wife had her eye on Joseph, and she went to him day after day and tried to seduce him, but he refused to even be near her. One day she caught him alone and forced herself on him. He ran away, but she grabbed his cloak as he fled, and he left it with her. And Potiphar's wife began screaming in anger. When people came to investigate, she told them that Joseph tried to rape her, and she used his cloak as evidence. And Potiphar was furious, and he had Joseph thrown into prison. Now, the story of Potiphar's wife was intentionally placed right after the story of Judah and Tamar by the editors of the book of Genesis. This placement highlights some important differences here between Joseph and Judah. Both men were tempted with sexual sin, but they both responded in very different ways. Now, we must also remember that not everything in the Bible was meant to serve as a good example for us to follow. Judah is an example example of bad living, and Joseph is an example of good living. And we must read both of these stories in the context of each other in order to see the bigger picture. Now Joseph was stuck in prison for 3 whole years, but the jailer noticed how smart he was and put him in charge of the other prisoners. One night, 2 prison mates, respectively the former cupbearer and former baker of Pharaoh, had dreams, and Joseph interpreted their dreams. The first man dreamed of 3 clusters of grapes, and the second man dreamed of 3 baskets of bread. The grapes were given to Pharaoh, and the bread was taken by the birds, which meant good news for Pharaoh's cupbearer, who in 3 days would be restored to his position, but bad news for Pharaoh's baker, who would in 3 days be killed and eaten by the birds. Now, the cupbearer promised to tell Pharaoh about Joseph's plight after he was released, but then completely forgot about Joseph once he got out. A couple years later, Pharaoh himself began having dreams that greatly troubled him, but none of his magicians could interpret his dreams. Finally, the cupbearer remembered Joseph, and Joseph was brought from prison to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. The first dream was about cows, and the second dream was about grain. Pharaoh dreamed of 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 skinny cows. He also dreamed that he saw 7 healthy stalks of grain being swallowed up by 7 sickly stalks. And Joseph interprets the dreams, saying that the 7 fat cows represent 7 years of plenty, and the 7 skinny cows represent 7 years of famine. The second dream is the same, the 7 healthy grain stalks representing 7 years of plenty, and the 7 sickly grain stalks representing 7 years of famine. The bad cows eating the good cows means that the bad years will make us forget the good years, and the bad grain eating the good grain also means that the bad years will make us forget the good years. The 2 versions of the same dream means that this will certainly happen. And Joseph told Pharaoh that he needed to appoint someone to oversee a grain tax on the people to store up enough food during the 7 years of plenty to save up for the 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of this project, and he gave Joseph an Egyptian wife and a new Egyptian name. Joseph's Egyptian name was zaphenath-paneah. We don't know what it means exactly, but a rough translation is, "The God speaks, he lives." Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain during the good years, and he had 2 sons whom he named Manasseh and Ephraim. And he said, "God has made me forget the troubles of my old life, and has given me a double blessing with my 2 sons." Manasseh means forget, and Ephraim means twice fruitful. After the 7 years of plenty were over, the famine struck hard, and Joseph opened the storehouses and began the distribution to the people. And the text says that the whole world came to buy grain.